Dear students, in the today's lecture, we'll be talking about the urban and industrial sociology. And that is basically we're taking from the paper 2, part C, unit 3. I don't know, I had told you that now since you will be busy with your mains, whenever you read any unit from the first paper, you just try to look at the similar unit of the second paper at the same time. So when we started talking about the work and economic life from the paper 1, unit 6, you just try to prepare this urban industrial one of the Indian society in the same go and try to link them in that perspective. Very less questions and contemporary questions will be there in terms of the urban poverty could be one area. Urbanism as a way of life, Louis Worth, that question was there. Some programs and policies could be there in terms of the urban sociology or the urban planning in India. Slums is a one area from where the questions have been there. You will also be finding about in terms of employability, urban employability. Child labor, I was looking at 1 or 2 times this question has been there. Trade union is another area from where the focus could be found, but these are more or less more of the factual kind of things there, in which you need to remember a few scholars to substantiate your view and also to make the examiner know that you know what the works Indian sociologists are basically dealing with. When we talk about the urban industrial sociology, basically, let me first talk about the urban one so that we'll be talking about in broader to the Indian concept. You all are aware of that right since the inception of sociology, sociology emerged as the study of industrial urban society. Thus, right since the emergence of sociology, the studies of urban settings, cities, towns, urban structure, industrial society has been a major theme where the sociologists have focused. And right from the classical scholars to the contemporary one, the sociologist somewhere seems to be preoccupied or somewhere turning their attention to the study of urban and industrial society. Notably, it is argued that with the works of George Simmel, a systematic understanding of the urban sociology that begins. And George Simmel could be considered as the father of urban sociology. Metropolis and a Mental Life, this is the one publication from where we will be finding about George Simmel. And also in the writings of Max Weber, we also find the inputs on the urban analysis. And that's why I say that when we look at the early period of the sociological discourse or sociological narratives, we find about the focus in the urban sociology. And urban sociology basically started looking at the analysis of urban living and the social relationship in the urban context. It is basically the study of life and interaction in a town, cities or metropolis. Yet another perspective through which the urban sociology has been approached, that urban sociology is also a normative discipline of sociology. When it's a norm, what ought to be? It's a normative discipline of sociology, attempting to study the structure, environmental processes, changes, and the problems of an urban area. particularly from classical to the neoclassical to the contemporary one. Somewhere the focus has been there on the study of urban industrial society. Broadly, when we are looking at, I told you to remember the three theoretical perspectives through which somewhere we will try to understand that how every unit of sociology that could be talked about. So broadly, when we are talking about the theoretical perspectives in terms of the studies of urban sociology, the functionist perspective, the conflict and the symbolic interactionism or interactionist perspective, that become the more important one. The focus of the functionist has been there that how cities have performed certain functions and how the town, cities, urban centers prove to be beneficial and are functional to the society. But the moment we move to the conflict perspective, the dysfunctionality, the dichotomies, the controversies, contradictions, that is basically being highlighted. That how the city seems to be run by the politico-economic elites who control the resources. And by controlling the resources, they basically try to enhance their positions, the socio-economic positions in a society. At the same time, city also reflects conflicts over norms, values between people. This has been the concerns of the conflict perspective. But when we come to the symbolic interactionist, they highlight that how the city residents differ in their types of interaction. And they not only differ in terms of the types of interaction, but also in terms of their perceptions of the urban life. Cities are not the chaotic places. As in most the moment you describe what are the features, anonymity to the conflict and tensions, differentiation. You just, through this you try to approach that what characterizes the urban life. But in a symbolic interactionism, it is saying that cities are not to be viewed as a chaotic place. Rather, you need to view it in terms of how the strong norms and values exist in the cities. The types of interaction that characterize. And in this very perspective, some other scholars like Gist, Kubrin, they would reveal that strong social bonds do exist in cities. If you remember in terms of mechanical to organic metaphor of Durkheim, I don't know whether you have come across in Durkheim's honeycomb system, that the perspective of the primary ties could also be seen in the cities. And I always say that when we look at the contemporary times, when we are studying the migration and the patterns of migration, mostly you will find about that the people coming from certain areas or any definite areas and they are migrating to the certain cities or metropolis, they basically prefer to stay with those who were from the same locality. And since they prefer to live together, some sort of culture tied to the land with which they had migrated, they also bring it to the cities. It was having a very sweeping generalization that the primary ties is broken, the secondary norms are important. Now, like the honeycomb system, we also may find about the primary relationship. Though certainly when we compare the rural to the urban one, the types of relationship will also be used to differentiate the rural and urban one. But it does not mean that the social bonds does not exist in the urban centers. Social bonds do exist. The nature may be different from the rural areas. Anonymity, where the people do not know one another, with which when we try to approach the urban life, then we are only talking about one type of nature. The urban sociology is also concerned with whether any kind of social bonds does exist in urban life or not. In the urban sociology, one of the important work or important tradition has been Chicago tradition, which has emphasized the demographic and ecological structure of the city, the social disorganization and pathologies of urban norms, urban lives, the normative order in the urban setting. These all have been basically picked from the Chicago tradition. Overall, the social pathologies of urban existence that has been highlighted. Though there has also emerged yet another perspective in the studies of in urban sociology, that is basically called the community studies, in which the ethnographic studies of the social structure of individual communities and the ways of life of the inhabitants have been emphasized. The Chicago one and the community studies can broadly be divided or could broadly be categorized in terms of culturalist and a structuralist approach. The culturalist approach would emphasize on how urban life is, how people feel and react by living in urban areas, and how the urban life is organized. This is a culturologist or culturalist perspective. It means this culturalist perspective will try to study culture, organizational and social psychological consequences of the urban life. Opposite to this, when we are talking about the structuralist perspective, which considers city as a physical embodiment of political and economic relationship. City itself is an effect of more fundamental forces in which the works of Louis Wirth, mind me, from here the question has been there, in which the works of Louis Wirth becomes the most important one when he says about that how urbanism is a way of life. You might have gone through that in terms of urbanism as a way of life. Now this is basically coming from the culturalist perspective, the structuralist perspective. Louis Wirth in his article Urbanism as a Way of Life, particularly in the American Journal of Sociology, in the 40s, 1938, basically focused on the transformation taking place with more and more people who are moving to the cities. And in this context, he is basically moving towards that how urbanism is emerging as a way of life, or the condition of living or urban condition of living is becoming the prominent form in modern life. He argues that there is something very specific about the cities that changes the ways in which people behave and interact, affecting people's personalities and also their ways of life. Urbanism is not just about living in a particular place. It means Urbanism is basically a way of life concerned less with the internal differentiation. Rather, it is a form of social existence. I repeat, it is a form of social existence. And from here Louis Wirth is also trying to look at that what are the common ways in defining cities. What are the criterions of understanding cities? One of the criterion has been the population size, the total number of people. However, he is now moving towards looking at some other factors. Within this, apart from the size, the density has been focused. That how many people live in a space or particular area. He views density is that how the large cluster of people who live there in a given area, in a particular area, it impacts the interaction. Or it impacts the individual's interaction with one another. In this context, mind the line idiot, in this context, he considers yet another defining factor that is called social heterogeneity. And when you say social heterogeneity, it is the third defining quality of cities or urban life in which the different racial, ethnic groups make up a place, manifesting city as a melting pot. And this melting pot is attracting the individuals composed of the different racial, ethnic groups. However, the type of relationship that has emerged is anonymous, since most of the people living in close proximity do not know each other. Implying that most contacts between city dwellers are partial, not total. It is a means to an end, rather than being a satisfied relationship. And thus, fundamentally, it is in contrast to the small traditional villages or the rural perspective. Impersonalization has taken place in cities. Individualism has increased in cities. Alienation has come out in the cities. Superficiality is characterizing the urban life. And the loneliness. It means when we are talking about the social heterogeneity which we have picked up from the perspective of density, that how urban centers are becoming a melting pot, attracting the people from the different racial and ethnic groups, ethnic composition. Then the certain features of social heterogeneity which he is speaking up is anonymity, impersonality, superficiality, individualism, loneliness, and that way, that quotient of urbanism as a way of life that could be talked about. At least one line I wanted you to add, if the such kind of quotient comes out. That Louis is agreeing with the Ferdinand Tönnies. You might have had Ferdinand Tönnies in terms of Jamin Saft to Gesellschaft. He is agreeing with the Ferdinand Tönnies that cities have weaker sense of community. When the transition is taking from the Gesellschaft to Jamin Saft to Gesellschaft, certainly the sense of community is weakening. But Louis Wirth is also agreeing with Durkheim that cities generate more creativity and greater tolerance for a new ways of thinking. Urban residents are considered to be more tolerated or more tolerant than the rural residents, as they are more exposed. The non-residential attitudes, behavior, lifestyle. These are the certain perspectives which are there in terms of the urban centers. And in this very perspective, that question which urbanism as a way of life, that could be done. It means broadly when you're talking about in terms of the size, density, occupation, changing forms of marriage, family, social heterogeneity, social distance, changing system of interaction, anonymity, individualism, greater mobility, role conflict, rapid socio-cultural change, emergence of voluntary organizations, secularization in outlook. You pick up all these points to characterize the urban life. I don't know whether you are aware of or you have heard of that statement of Sorokin, that rural areas are basically like a calm pond, urban areas are like a boiled kettle. So the secondary relationship, anonymity, superficiality, individualism, loneliness, alienation, broadly these kind of features which have been used to characterize the urban life. But in the last class, when we started talking about the rural agrarian structure, we picked up one of the dimensions, that is in terms of that how to view rural and urban. True that sociology emerges the study of urban industrial society, and somehow or other in the very main focus of sociology, in the main tradition of sociological institutionalization growth, urban industrial society was basically viewed as a peasantless society. Fine. But outside the Western Europe, when the studies on agrarian began, and more precisely in the third world countries, then somewhere the two concepts found their emergence. Sorokin, Zimmerman, when we are talking about, they are the one who had basically talked about the concept of rural-urban dichotomy, that these are the two poles apart kind of. But particularly with the works of Redfield, I told you, Robert Redfield, the idea emerged out that we do not have to look at the rural and urban as the two distinct polar one. There is a connectivity between these two. And thus the opposite of the concept rural-urban dichotomy, the concept which was popularized by Robert Redfield, was a rural-urban continuum. And in this very perspective, now when we have broadly looked at, then let me not forget to say you that when we are looking at the growth of Indian sociology, from 1919-1920, from where the Mumbai University Department of Sociology came out, and from where you understand that how sociology developed, and slowly and gradually in the different decades that has institutionalized. Basically, the Indian sociology began its journey with the study of cities, the urban life. It means the earlier phase of sociology in India, studies of rural society was emphasized, but we should remember that the first sociology department in India, Mumbai University, was started as a center for urban studies in 1990. The universities of Mumbai, along with the universities of Calcutta, Madras, also focused their attention on the urban studies, and particularly from the late 50s, the studies on urban society gained momentum with the growth of Indian sociology. That's why I say that when you're talking about the studies of urban sociology in India, and India being the third world country, it realized that to understand the Indian society, the rural perspective cannot be neglected, because maximum population is living in the rural area, rural agrarian structure. They are engaged in this agriculture, or agriculture is a way of life. But despite this, when we are looking at the growth of sociology basically, right from Mumbai to Calcutta to Madras or Chennai now, we are finding about how the studies on urban centers, urban lives, cities that emerged. It means right since the emergence of sociology, that's why I say the right since the emergence of sociology, the studies on the urban life, the urban cities have been a prime concern. And over the decades, that has gained the different kind of perspective. Now if I am not, you can also check it out. Approximately 32 to 34% of the Indian population lives in urban areas. And when you look at the census, we talked about that how all the places which have municipalities, corporations, cantonment boards, notified town area committee, satisfying the criteria like minimum 5,000 population, 75% of population engaged in non-agricultural activities, with a density of at least 400 persons per square kilometer, can be termed as town, within which the concept of statutory town and census town that comes out. Though we also need to remember that when we talk about the early urbanization in India, that early urbanization in India started coming from the rural centers, in which the term urbanization seems to be the more important one. If any one of you is recalling back G.S. Ghurye, then you will be finding about that how he has also talked about the growth of the urban centers, and in which the term urbanization will become the more important one. It means now when we are looking at urbanization, it can broadly be perceived as concentration of population in urban areas, or population shift from rural to the urban areas, or it can also be perceived as an increase in the population in urban areas. Broadly, the two perspectives through which the urbanization has been viewed. The structuralist perspective and the technical perspectives. And in general, it has always been said that urbanization and industrialization go hand in hand. However, we do need to remember that it is not always the case. And particularly in the Indian context, when you are talking about the Harappa civilization, it was more urbanized civilization. The such kind of sweeping words which you read and we write, you just think on that very perspective, talking about that one. The Indian sociologists are also concerned not only with urban life, the behavior, relationship, modes of thoughts, but they are also talking about the changes that is taking place. The environmental concerns, the urban poverty, the programs and policies, the employment opportunities. These all are the perspective through which now the Indian sociologists are basically focusing on the urban life. And in this very perspective, there could be a question in terms of urbanism as a way of life we talked about. There could be a question in terms of rural-urban interaction. There could be a question on social effects. So, right from anonymity to the development of classes and individuality, superficiality, whatever the features we talked about, that you can talk about in terms of social effects. Dissipating primary relationship or loss of primary relationship, preponderance of secondary relationship, changing cultural values, cultural shifts or gradual cultural shifts, changing pattern in the traditional institutions like family, marriage, kinship, increasing rate of crime, divorce, juvenile delinquencies, the crimes done by the children. So this way you can pick up the social effects from where the questions could be talked about. I am still saying before we go, you just keep an eye on the urban policies and the processes. And in terms of the urban processes and policies, the National Institute of Urban Affairs has published a book on the state of India's urbanization, which is considered as the first detailed demographic profile of India's urbanization. Amitabh Kundu has conducted many meaningful studies on the urban processes, and Kundu is of the view that though there seems to be concerns for the urban poor, but the solutions have increased the inequalities in the existing urban systems, implying that the flow of resources are in the favor of the rich. Some names I am using so that you can write it down, and if the questions are there, you can make it more sociological. A.M. Sachidanandan critically argued that the policy of relocating the role of or the pace of urbanization in favor of rural development, he argued that employment potentiality in rural areas is limited. And that's why developmental policies require high level of investment. Otherwise, it would be very difficult to control the growth of cities, and it will be too difficult to look at to control the influx of people from the rural to the urban areas. Now, I don't know whether this question which has been asked in a GS to bridge the gap between rural and urban, Pura, APJ Abdul Kalam's work. So just keep an eye on a Pura 2, and particularly from 2016, how Pura 2 has been succeeded by Syama Prasad Mukherjee Urban Mission. So there could be possibility that this, in terms of rural-urban divide or to bridge the rural-urban one, such programs could be there. So beginning with the Pura, then we'll talking about in terms of Syama Prasad Mukherjee Urban Mission. And then there could be in terms of, there are so many works. Sanjay Chakravarti talks a critical look at the mega cities programs of the government of India, particularly in cities like Mumbai, Kolkata, Chennai, Hyderabad and Bangalore. And he raises the three questions. Is the amount of money being invested too little, or has it come too late to turn the situation around? This is the number one question he raises in urban policies and programs. And second question he raises, in the programs being targeted to the wrong cities. And the Sanjay Chakravarti is now raising the third concern. Will the elite continue to remain the beneficiary and urban poor remains to be neglected? Yet another work has been there by the Yogesh Atal, who attempts to underline the effects made in the last few decades. He categorically asserts that the new developmental paradigms must focus on reaching the unreached, mind the word, reaching the unreached, and on saving both the natural and the cultural environment of the cities. So Amitabh Kundu, S.M. Sachidanandan, Sanjay Chakravarti, Yogesh Atal, if you remember few. Reaching the unreached, such kind of words will certainly be more lucrative, more catchy. There could be yet another dimension in urban sociology has been the studies on the urban poverty. It means now when we are looking at the Indian sociologists, their concerns, apart from not only the city interaction, the behavior, modes of pattern, changes, urban planning, policies, one of the most critical areas that is now emerging in the Indian sociological works is basically the studies of urban poverty. The work of Sunita Chaudhary, which deals with the socio-structural aspect of urban poor. The work is on the beggars in the two areas of Calcutta, revealing that how the beggars have preserved or constructed society and culture in the limited economic and social setting. Meera Bapat, Nizel Crook, they have worked on the drought affected migrants, Marathwada region, that how due to the drought the certain families flew to Pune, and how the struggle for survival began there when they have shifted from the drought hit areas to the Pune. Arup Mitra examined the relevance of trickle down mechanism of the growth of poverty in the urban context in India. The supporters of trickle down effect asserts that the development of the cities can be efficient only if market forces are allowed to operate, and thus should be little regulation from the state that would benefit all sections of urban population. The work reveals that very little of the income generated from the market manufacturing and tertiary sector actually benefit the poor, as there are limited jobs created for them. Now Arup Mitra is also arguing that the best way to ease urban poverty is to provide the gainful employment to the poor through rapid industrialization oriented toward the growth of employment, in which state intervention in industrialization is needed. What we are post-91 we are talking about? A rollback state concept. It means a market-oriented perspective has been emphasized. Laissez-faire approach is emerging out, that the state should not intervene in the process of the market. And somehow or other, post-liberalization, the classical economics of Adam Smith is on the rise. A market-oriented approach has started emerging out. And that is affecting the entire global culture. But here when you are talking about Arup Mitra and others, they say no. Rather than only talking about that how operation of the market should be left, no. There must be government intervention in the industrialization or industrial sectors, so that it would be ensuring the employability, possibility of employment to the urban poor. Sanjay Roy, he uses the Marxist framework, tried to understand the nature of dialectical relationship between the ruling class and the urban poor. He has collected data from the 3 slums of Calcutta and found the class formations within these slums. He concludes that the position that the state takes in supporting the class determines the nature of relations between the classes. Once again, Amitabh Kundu studies the access to basic amenities by the urban poor. And he is basically concluding that despite specific programs, policies, how the poor are not benefiting in actual practice. In either you talk about PDS, either you talk about in terms of the shelters, or you talk about the water supply, sanitation, healthcare. The poor are basically receiving the substantial, not the major part of the benefits, but a very small portion of the benefits is reaching to them. which reflect that how the government policies are failing. Housing for the urban poor, R.S. Sandhu highlighted poverty in urban areas is due to societal injustice and inequalities in one hand, and the poor planning and inept management of the urban resources on the other hand. So that way, the some works you can pick up in terms of the urban poverty if the questions are there, because this is the one area from where you do not enjoy more of the factual data that you will have to talk about, so find the catchwords. But let me say that whatever the scholars which I am quoting it, they are necessary. I told you very first day that when we are talking about the Indian sociology seems to be as rich as that of the Western sociology. And there are innumerous works almost in every area where the sociological empirical works are emerging out. So you cannot be simply writing about the GS kind of perspectives. Once you have picked up the certain topics from urbanism as of life, rural-urban continuum or rural-urban interaction, then we have talked about the urban processes, policies, urban poors, some of the, remember the names which I am talking about. One important area from the unit 3, part C, unit 3, in a second paper has been the slums. And even in a first paper GS, when you are talking about urbanization, problems and the remedies, there could be a question on slums. What do you have to do? That all these scholars which you are using in sociological paper, they are not to be used in a GS. But since there is a commonality between these topics, so major understanding of you would be coming out. How would you be presenting the answer? That is the most important one. So in the urban sociology, particularly in India, yet another important variable of analysis has been slums. And slums have been viewed as a common feature of all urban centers, industrial centers. Simply, it is a highly populated urban residential area consisting of densely packed housing units of weak built quality. Slums are viewed as an aberration to the urban development. In India, the slums are usually classified into 3 criterions or categories. The old buildings that have become dilapidated and deoriented in the course of time. The slums that are, number 2, the slums that are characterized by poor and inadequate housing conditions constructed largely around mills and factories. And number 3, the slums that illegally come up in the different parts of the city through unauthorized occupation of open land. Squatters, that word, if SQUATT, squatters. And when we look at the perspective of census, slum has been defined as a residential area where dwellings are unfit for the human habitation by regions of dilapidation, overcrowding, faulty management, design of such buildings, narrowness, lack of ventilation, light, and so on. When we focus on the National Institute of Urban Affairs, New Delhi, it observes that the emergence of slums is necessarily the product of 3 forces. When we are talking about how the slums emerge. Number 1, demographic dynamism of a city attracting more people from the rural areas, offering greater potential for employment. Number 2, its capacity or incapacity to meet the rising demands of housing. And number 3, the existing urban land policies that prohibit the access of the poor to the urban land market. It means these are the 3 through which the National Institute of Urban Affairs talked about that how the slums are produced. And if there is no accessibility to the market or urban land market, and they do not have a much greater employability, lucrative employability, then somehow or other the urban poor are left with no choice but basically to take shelter illegally in a many available place of land, and thus slum is a consequence of a blight in the old parts of the city. In a government of India, for purpose of implementation of various schemes related to urban development, has defined our slums area as follows. Slum areas means any area where such a dwelling predominate which by reason of dilapidation, overcrowding, faulty management, faulty design of building, narrowness and faulty arrangement of street, lack of ventilation, light, sanitation or other facilities seems to be diminishing in the city life, in which apathy, social isolation characterize a slum. R.S. Sandhu's studies on savings and indebtedness among the poor is insignificant. He has worked on the Amritsar and Delhi to understand the specificity of slums in metropolis and small cities. And he finds that how the slum dwellers of Amritsar, they enjoy better housing condition than Delhi is poor. The slum dwellers of Amritsar are more literate than the slum dwellers of Delhi, and that way the work of R.S. Sandhu can be talked by you in terms of, if the question comes in terms of slum. E.R. Desai and Devdas Pillai analysis is also important. Their focus has been there in terms of, basically I am talking about because such kind of questions are coming out in terms of the women. So E.R. Desai and Devdas Pillai's work in women in slums, politics and slums has been dealt comprehensively, whereas Sabir Ali has dealt with an interesting phenomenon in urban poverty, in which he explored a slum within slums. Mind the word. You will be using the word slums within slums. What do you say about some many times if you look at your own city, and I don't know where do you live. But particularly if I talk about the Delhi, where I am living for more than 3 decades. In our hostel in DU, there was a slum. So the slum development, through the slum development programs, they were basically shifted to Rohini side. And the buildings started coming out. They were allotted the buildings. But slowly and gradually found that the buildings through which they were rehabilitated, resettled, the further influx of the migrants who started coming out, they started occupying the surrounding areas. And thus slums within slums, that concept comes out. So if this concept you are using, slums within slums, which is the newer perspective which you are talking about, we find about how you will be using the name Sabir Ali. Squatter settlements, I just said about that, wherever there is an open areas, you find about that illegally they will be occupying. So the slums and squatter development is one of an important characteristics of the urban industrial society, urban sociology. And there has been work by Chetan Vaidya and R. K. Mukundan, that how the poor living in the slums who have been basically allotted through the slum redevelopment programs, the housing, the house, they have basically leased it out to some others on the rent. So that way you can talk about Chetan Vaidya and K. Mukundan. They find that the houses of families living in urban slums are frequently letting out to others, which is an additional source of income for these families. These scholars recommend that subleasing should be permitted under the slum improvement program, as this provides cheap housing for the tenants and also the supplement to the owner's income. Some sociological works have also been there, that how in terms of the slum development or resettlement, the bureaucrats, the government officials, they are the one who become the actual beneficiaries and not the urban poor. So in that way we find about that the certain works that has been there. Earlier when we were talking about, still when talking about, we will be looking at the Dharavi in Mumbai, we find about the different kind of culture that has emerged out. And it is always said that you can take the person out of Dharavi but not the Dharavi out of the person. So that way the different life is emerging out. And in this very perspective we will be looking at that if earlier the slums were viewed with suspicion, reflecting the process of ghettoization, and they were considered to be the scars on the urban life. The earlier biased notion attributed slums with the negative characteristics in terms of anti-social activities, crimes. However, it is also true that slums play a positive role in the city's economy, as they not only provide cheap housing for the working poor, which helps in reducing labor cost, but also provide cheap labor, which otherwise would have cost more to the urban residents. Now today, in the wake of globalization, the very perspective which is emerging out is the global city. And in mega cities. But in this process of the global city, the mega city and their formation, we should not forget the certain problems of the slums, and we should have the better urban planning policies, that the better settlement would be there. And somewhere you can also suggest that unless and until a better educational, economic, technological development is focused in the rural areas, it would be too difficult to stop the migration from the rural to the urban areas. And since most of the people who are migrating, they are basically coming, the pull factor that is making them to come, the plaza culture, the hope of anticipation of employability, more employment opportunities in urban areas, they will be coming out. And they would basically be having their occupation in the open lands, illegal kind of the slums, because that will provide them the cheap housing. So that way you can, certain suggestions. Look, your suggestions should always be practical, not philosophical. Either you are writing about the mains or if you are going for the interview. If the certain suggestions are asked, ensure that your suggestions are practical, empirical, not philosophical. Do not philosophize. Provide the practical solutions, so that when you talk about the slums and others, provide the better solutions. That if you are shifting the people from one area in a city development program or slum development resettlement programs, we should also ensure the certain perspective of employability to these people. Otherwise, what they will do? They will lease it out, and once they have leased it out on the rent, they will once again moving to the nearby areas, and another slums will be starting emerging out. In terms of allotment, there must be a very close scrutiny that who are the actual beneficiaries. Talk about the functional dimensions we talked about. So they have asked the slums are the scars of the city life or urban life. So such kind of perspective, it is also said that the functional perspective could be there. The cheap housing, cheap labor. And that way the certain names which I have quoted, that could be talked about. But I will also request you that since you have gone through in a GS, also keep an eye on the certain programs and policies. When I said Sama Prasad Mukherjee Rural Mission Pura, that program which has been succeeded, there could be, you look at the Swachh Bharat Mission to Deen Dayal Antodaya Yojana, and there could be a question in terms of National Heritage City Development and Augmentation Yojana. It's there. And do read, just read it in terms of Amrut, Atal Mission for Rejuvenation of Urban Transportation. If anyone is from Delhi, you will be finding about in the blue lines JNNURM, Jawaharlal Nehru National Urban Renewal Mission, such kind of programs which have come out. So we'll be talking about that way. So Amrut. So keep a focus on the new kind of programs for the urban policies what the government has initiated. And that way, the urbanism as a way of life, rural-urban interaction, urban policies, programs, urban poverty, slums. You just talk about this kind of perspective and then prepare such kind of short notes so that, and just give only one reading. Jog down for you that if urban poverty is coming out, these are the two scholars which I am going to pick. Urban slums coming out, these are the two scholars I am going to use. The idea is basically your analytical skill to be substantiated with the empirical works which the Indian sociologists are doing or have done. And once you have done that, then apart from the urban sociology, yet another areas of interest, that would be basically the industrial sociology. Just I'll take 2 minutes and then I'll 2-minute break and then we'll begin that one. Let's begin that one. This is yet another area. Once again, I am saying that when we are going through the Unit 6, first paper, Work and Economic Life, and more precisely when we started looking, we talked about the impact of globalization, and in which particularly in formulation of activities, feminization of labor in 80s, that how these concepts started gaining out. So we focus on that very perspective, and when we are talking about the sociology of organization, we talked about the formal and informal organization. I'll be giving certain names in terms of the industrial sociology. Almost in every developed country, the industrial sociology has been one of the major sub-branch in sociology. From the early 20th century, we will be finding about that how this urban sociology that has started gaining its shape. The two basic objectives has been there in terms of the industrial sociology. That is basically the industrial sociology uses current sociological theories to study the organizational structure of industries, in which Weberian theory of bureaucracy provided the key impetus to the area. Besides this, sociological also attempted to improve the efficiency of organization by modifying the existing structure by interpersonal relationships. So we talked about the Taylorism, we talked about the Mao. So this is the one perspective within which the Indian industrial sociology would be concerned of. The second objective of industrial sociology is to study the impact of industries on society, changes in a social relationship resulting from industrial development. It means now we are talking about the same perspective which we talk about how the industries have changed the relationship. Broadly, when we are looking at the industrial growth pattern in India, some phases will be coming out. The first phase is from 1951 to 1965. Post-independently, we are talking about the first 3 5-year plans tries to build a strong industrial base in India. Then the second phase is basically from 1965 to 1980s, considered to be the phase of declaration and retrogression. This phase covered the period of 3 ad hoc annual plans, 4th, 5th 5-year plans. And then the third phase from 1981 to 99, which is considered to be the phase of industrial recovery, covering the period of 80s, consisting of both the 6th and 7th 5-year plan. Alright? And then fourth phase is basically the post-reform period, in which from year 1991 we will be talking about. Though in some of the writings I was finding that they are talking about that how the 30 years of the globalization which India has moved from 2021. So the fifth phase could be there in terms of from 2021. So this is basically the growth, urban industrial growth in India post-independently. And in this very perspective, when you are talking about that, you will be looking at that how industrial sociology is closely related with the sociology of work and occupation. And in the Indian context, the first studies in Indian sociology was by N.R. Seth, 1957, Charles Mayers in 1958. Seth studied the factories in Baroda, New Vadodara, whereas Mayers studied managerial practices and labor productivity. Richard Lombard's study is also important here, with the study of 5 factories in Pune in 1963. The work of Baldev R. Sarma in 1987 is yet another important component in the industrial sociology in India. The cooperations and conflict between labor and management in steel plants, the work by Subbarao, A.B. Subbarao is at another dimension. It means when you remember N.R. Seth, Charles Mayer's, Lombard's, alright, and talk about R. Sarma in 1987, A.B. Subbarao's work on the corporations. So this way you will be talking about the works on the industrial sociology. But the major focus which I am finding in your questions, that you just basically focus on the labor in the formal organization or formal sector. That question could be there because the moment we have had the understanding of the formal organizations and the informal organizations which you talked about in work and economic life, take a lead from there, and then I'll be just quoting about the certain Indian scholars, so that and their works which I have just noted down, so that the new works which have come out, the sociological works which have been published. Alright, I do not know whether the students have accessibility to this or not, but this journals which comes to me through which from ICSSR, Indian Council of Social Science Research, that they compile the works of their contemporary sociologists in the different areas of Indian society, so that the certain works will come out, and that way one of the key point in terms of answering the second paper is to substantiate your view with the sociological empirical works. So in this very perspective, some works, some names which I am talking about, so that if you remember 1 or 2 names, you would basically be able to provide the sociological perspective, and this will also be helping you fetch more marks. It will also be making you move away from the general studies orientation to the pure sociological orientation. That you have to remember that you are answering all the questions in a sociology. These questions have been raised in sociology paper. So your answers should be with the sociological perspective, substantiating the views with a certain kind of sociological works with the names. If you remember 1 or 2, I am not saying that you remember all, some 4 or 5, 6 scholars which I am giving, whichever you will remember, that would be more than enough. The formal or organized sector plays an important role in the country's development. However, in the India, compared to the informal sector, this sector is much smaller in size. Sociologically, the distinction between formal and informal sector is crucial for understanding employment relationship. Workers in the formal sectors are engaged in factories, in commercial and service establishment of the government, in which 70% of the workers in this sector are employed in government or quasi-government and public sector enterprises. The private sector provides employment to nearly 30% of labor in the formal sector, almost. The wages of the formal sector workers are substantially higher than those engaged in the urban informal sector. Moreover, a range of urban laws generating permanency of employment, provision of retirement benefits, social securities, alright, labor laws, these all would be through which we just basically try to look at the formal sectors. But when you look at the industrial policies post 1991, where India marched toward the process of liberalization and globalization, the opening of the market that started, the policy envisioned a greater and more sufficient role for the private sector. And thus, somehow, the public sector withdrew itself from all areas except the 4 sectors, consequently leading to downsizing of the large industries by shifting production to one of the urban industrial country. And now it means it is also started offering the voluntary retirement schemes to the workers. In this context, E.A. Ramaswamy has made significant contribution to the sociology of industrial relations, in which he provided case studies of union activities and management responses located in the cities like Mumbai, Kolkata, Chennai, Bangalore. The work of E.A. Ramaswamy reveals that in Kolkata the government has more pre-worker, or government is having more, the government mentality is more toward the pro-worker than in other 3 cities due to the communist political setup. The study found that the unions and employers often collided with one another. Workers were left out, whereas the work of G. Karunanidhi, Nithi, N-I-T-H-I, Nithi, emphasize the role of caste in formal sector, in which he reveals that caste is a strong guiding force in a rural type of mills, the mills which are having their closeness to the rural areas than urban mills. Whereas Parveen J. Patel's study of industrial relations in manufacturing unit attempts to explorate or extrapolate the wider theoretical implications regarding two social processes, that is, the social polarization and social mobilization. He finds that the social legitimacy of the employers get eroded when workers spread across different locations of the companies. The defining of social cleavages within the organization helps mobilize workers into the collective actions. The workers then seek support from the macro structures like political parties. This is the work which we are talking about in terms of Patel's. And there is one another work of the Jonathan's ethnographic study of the workers of Vilai steel plant, discusses the work and work group in the plant. He reveals that the public sector employment and the company township have organized different migrant communities to integrate with the new social setting. The new kind of social solidarity is created, which run contrary to the traditional caste or community based solidarity. And in this pick up the such kind of dimensions that how in the globalization and labor mixed industries are coming out, the gradual spread of market principles have led to the wide inter-regional and intersectoral differences in the levels of economic activities. The national industrial relation system has given way to many local industrial relation system post 91. Labor in the informal sector, there is a duality of formal and informal that has been there, or particularly in India, particularly in the underdeveloped and developing countries, the informalization of activities, that concept we talked about and you are aware of. So we find about that how a large segment of the population is basically having its engagement in the informal sector, and the burden is basically increasing. Even when you talk about the mechanization and automation and use of machines in the rural areas in agricultural works. So now the fewer people are required, and in that way we find about a large perspective of or large number of people are becoming unemployed, otherwise who could have been there in terms of hidden employment in agriculture. So they are the one who are coming and then who are to the urban areas, migrate to the urban areas in search of employability, and they are basically unskilled one, illiterate one. Thus they are engaging themselves with the informal sector. So how the increase in informal sector is that is coming out. So the labor in informal sector, that is the one the quotient could be there. So in the Indian context, the bulk of country's labor force is an informal sector, and the major sections of the workers in this sector are engaged in agriculture. Though the sector has been in existence for a very long time, it gained formal recognition by the ILO only in the mid 1970s. The term, we had talked about the term informal sector was coined by Keith Hart, an economist who was studying a labor market in Arka, Ghana. In early 70s, he was unable to classify the large number of workers who did not have permanent employment and who floated around changing time in terms of their occupations. And he did not find the more appropriate terms, that what appropriate terms could be provided to these people who are working in this. So he basically called it informal sector as opposed to the well regulated and legally protected formal sector. The informal sector has always been regarded as the residual sector, and during 70s and 80s the belief surfaced that with the expansion of industrialization, this sector would be drawn into formal sector. But opposite to this wistful thought, wistful desire or thinking in terms of the planners, rather than being absorbed, that informal sector being absorbed in the formal sector, it grew in size and established its own identity. At the same time, unfortunately in India, despite the large number involved, this sector remains invisible. And when say that this large segment or population engaged with the informal sectors remain invisible, So most of the benefits, statutory laws, which were given to the laborers associated with the formal sector, the people who are indulged in the informal sector, they are basically lacking such kind of perspective. And post-COVID, we have also found the data that how curtailing of the different manufacturing or industries, we find about how this increasing unemployability has led the people, a very good, qualified, skilled one, some were related with the formal sectors, they have now moved in search of into the informal sectors. So that way the burden is increasing, that phenomena could be talked about. In 1986, when the ILO passed a convention on a home-based work, it began to gain some importance. The informal sector started gaining some importance in a national plans. In this context, Andrew M. Singh and Aretha Kellis in 1987 with their studies on house-based work propounded the term invisible hands, similar to that of the Adam Smith. John Bremen's contribution to the study of labor in the informal sector has been recognized very widely. He has studied the conditions of non-agricultural laborers in South Gujarat for several decades. John Bremen, B-R-E-M-N, John Bremen. Attention towards increased labor mobility and migration, which seems to be understood in the official statistics. O.P. Sarma has worked on this, his paper. He has written a paper in 1997 highlighting the issues that post-1991 reforms concerning the unorganized labor, in which Sarma argues that the condition of labor has become more worse after the reforms. Isita Mukhopadhyay, with her work on Kolkata, finds that the city has had a high percentage of workers in the informal sector. Kuch naam, just you remember some names, but do remember the name Andrew M. Singh and Anita Callis. Very important in terms of invisible hands, in terms of informal sector. Then in India, John Bremen's works in South Gujarat, this is another perspective. And I just quoted about the certain more works in terms of the informal sector. So, Ishita Mukhopadhyay, Manjit Singh studies of the labor process in the garment industries in Ludhiana or Delhi. This is the one work that we will be talking about. In India, some of the works, the impact of closure of textile industries, particularly in Mumbai and Ahmedabad, reveal that how the closure of these industries made a large segment of workers in the formal sector being forced to take up the low-paying wages, insecure jobs in the informal sector. So you pick up that one, the closure of the textile one. Daryl M. D. highlights the decline of textile industry in Mumbai. This is yet another work which you can talk about. More or less the similar perspective of informal sector we talked about, that how the major population which is indulged in the informal sector is basically in India is the Dalit, the women, the tribals, the poor, the illiterates, having the certain kind of similar social composition. So you pick up, but you just remember some of the names, that how they are working with the insecure jobs, no better pay, no legal protections, no social security, loss of jobs is another fear. So just pick up such kind of perspective within which we will be talking about the informal sector. There is one work which I wanted you to know, that is by Rajeshwari Deshpande, suggesting the role of civil society in precisely to acknowledge the contribution of the informal sector to the economy and society. So this way you talk about the forces, and basically the questions which would be there in terms of the informalization of activities. So that we talked about. You remember some other works. Apart from the informalization of activities and the workers in the formal one, some names, sociological work, basically which you have talked about, the conceptually which you are aware of. You just go through that lecture on the work and economic life, and we're finding about the formal and informal one. Then we talked about Weber, we talked about tailor, mayo. We also talked about the informal sector, informalization of activities. The point here in a third paper, that's why I say that you just do not bifurcate the first and second paper. Point is there, just prepare one or two names, the Indian sociological works, and which are the most important one, which are the most established one, recognized one, so that you will be providing a better understanding to your answer, or better framework to your answer. And now yet another area that we have talked about in terms of feminization of labor, it means there could be a question on women in work. Alright, now the certain perspective from the women's dimension that is coming out, women empowerment and others that may come out. So in an industrial perspective, more precisely when looking at the impact of globalization, so the feminization of labor is another perspective, that how the percentage of women or number of women in a workforce is increasing. So last class we talked about feminization of agriculture, some factors we talked about. So this is the one question we talked about. Here feminization of labor is the one question that has been there. And particularly from the decades of 80s and 90s, this very concept feminization of labor has gained the momentum, in which we are basically trying to look at the relations between women and the workforce. There are volumes of studies in this area, and ironically look at the duality. Volumes of works are emerging out, but there has been also a gaps in research in a women and work. A large section of research is concentrated in the informal sector. Undoubtedly, women workers form a third of this sector in an informal one, attracting the eyes of sociologists. But it is also ironical that similar interest in the formal sector has not been found, and hence there is a very little information on how women in the formal industries, force or industrial sectors are doing and how they are working on. The information and communication technology, ICT, that has developed has also attracted a large number of female workers, and in most cities where this type of outsourcing is done. Alright, so in the BPO industry we talked about that, how the youths and the women's, they are the one, and how the women seems to be employed in terms of the soft industries like the toy making, the apparel, the leather making, or in computers, the data analysis. And in this very perspective, we are finding about that how the number of women in the informal sector is increasing. So that way, the women in work, such kind of questions could be done it. However, you do mention the line that how these are working in terms of no retirement benefits, no social security, no health insurance. Alright, working in a very pathetic conditions, the environmental conditions, the physical conditions of the factories. Alright, lack of unionism of the women's. Alright, you can also pick up at another dimension that is there in terms of the sexual abuse in a workplace. Alright, the Visakha guidelines say aage, just you go through that one. POSH, this one question was there, prevention of sexual harassment. So such kind of questions could also come from there when you're talking about the women in work, the challenges before the Indian women in a workforce. So that way you can pick up. So these are the things which are to be anticipated. These are the things to be thought by you in terms of understanding that from where the questions could be there. How women employment affects their domestic activities could be at another area, the double burden. Alright. And in this way, the women and their work reflects double shifts, that is in terms of one at the workplace and one at the home. And if the first shift is work for wages, then the second shift is home is unpaid work. We'll finding about how this is the one sentence where I say unpaid work is no work. Mindalini Gore and others, when we talked about the Bombay hikes, they said about that how unpaid work is no work. It means when you're talking about the women's, so we are talking about the double shifts, one at the factory, workplace, and one at the home. One is basically for the wage, that is the paid one, another is the unpaid one. In this context, let me give you the ISA board Dutch sociologist with her study on the gender aspect of industrialization in India and Mexico reveals that women do not have much bargaining position in informal sectors, whereas Hilary Stenning studies in Calcutta focuses on the impact of their inter-household relations and family ideologies. Uma Kalpaggan is the another work which is very important in terms of informalization in Indian context, informalization of activities and the role of women in the workforce. So, if we talk about Uma Kalpaggan, she explored the different aspects of labor and gender, in which the focus on patriarchy and gender is most significant. In the garment industry, electronics, service and processing sectors, the women get crowded into unskilled, low-wage jobs. Kalpaggan found that the patriarchal role of the state reinforces, mind the word, patriarchal role of the state reinforces cultural norms where women are constructed as dependent, thus providing the rationale for women's subservience to males in the family, household, property ownership and the other aspects of their lives. This quote, Uma Kalpaggan, could also be quoted by you in terms of patriarchy, sexual division of labor and entitlement. So you can pick up that work from ISA board to Hilary Stenning to this Uma Kalpaggan. And here one or two works will Leela Fernandez, Nirmala Banerjee with their works reveal that even the trade unions have marginalized the women's and the trade unions movement was mostly used to protest only male workers to safeguard the interest of the male workers, and in effect it turned against women workers. Jimol Uni provides evidence of the growing informalization of the female labor force in South Asian countries. The low quality of employment available to women in the informal economy is evident, reflecting differential wages and income, implying a very little feminization of the workforce. So you pick up the marginalization of the women workers, and once you have done this one, then you look at the trade unions. This is the one perspective that could be there, because that quotient, sometimes the quotients could be there, its formation, its movement. Broadly, the trade union movement in India can be distinctively studied through three phases, in which the first phase concerned the period from 1987 with the end of World War I. This phase was mainly characterized by a humanitarian spirit that was employed by the friendly societies in dealing with the labor. The second phase began from end of World War I and continued till 1947, the year of India's independence. This phase was quite remarkable as it saw the beginning of real modern trade unionism in India, with organized continuous labor movement. The earliest trade union was formed in Mumbai when textile mills were established in 1851. The trade union emerged in Calcutta in 1854 with the establishment of jute mills, within which Sorabji, Majumdar were among the pioneers of these early labor uprisings. In 1879, first factory commission was set up to study the problems of the workers, factual beta, the workers. And in 1891, the Indian Factory Act was passed, but it remained ineffective. The second factory commission was formed in 1884, to which a memorandum signed by N.M. Lokhande along with approximately 500 workers was submitted to the submitted, and thus Lokhande emerged as the first trade union leader of India. In the year 1890s, he arranged a mass rally in which the desire surfaced to keep Sunday as a working off. The submission of memorandum was accepted by the Mill Owners Association, and consequently first trade union called Mumbai Mills Hands Association was formed, subsequently followed by the formation of other trade unions across the country, and thus began the organized strikes. Trade union like Ahmedabad workers in 1885, Jute Mills Kolkata 1896, Bombay Mill Workers 1897 were formed. Some of the notable strikes that took place during that period were by the Madras port workers, press workers, printers union Calcutta, and the Bombay postal unions, within which the Madras textile workers strike was considered most remarkable. Began the phase of great trade union movement momentum in India. The Madras Labour Union was formed in 1918 1918 with BP Wadia as the president, who commented that the economic aim of the Indian labor movement is not only to get higher wages and other benefits, but to completely eradicate wage slavery. BP Wadia आ जाएंगे बेटा, वहाँ से देख लेना थोड़ा सा. और Lokhande I just said about. N.M. Joshi, who in 1921 was quite influential in persuading government of India to accept the resolution pertaining to the legislations. So N.M. Joshi को ले लेना बेटा. Then Wadia is the one through which we'll talk about the All India Trade Union Congress, ITC in 1920. Lala Lajpat Rai has played an important role. He was elected to be the first president. Lala Lajpat Rai, he also attended ILO conference in Geneva in 1926. Subsequently, the Indian National Trade Union Congress, INTAC, Hind Mazdoor Sabha, Center of Indian Trade Union, C2 were formed. ये सब थोड़ा सा देख लेना बेटा, थोड़ा सा नाम को याद रखना, ट्रेड यूनियन के डोमेन को देख लेना. एक वर्क है बेटा, दिस इज द मोर इम्पोर्टेंट वर्क इन टर्म्स ऑफ द बैंकिंग, इंश्योरेंस, रेलवे, पोस्टल सर्विसेज, दैट इज बाय सुंदर. द स्ट्रॉन्ग होल्ड ऑफ द पॉलिटिकल यूनियन हैज बीन चैलेंज्ड बाय द ग्रोथ ऑफ द इंटरप्राइजेज यूनियंस. यहाँ से देख लेना. Once precisely after 91, when India marched toward the globalized economy, as most of the employers adopted various labor flexibility measures, and thus the need was felt to restructure the trade unions, and that way the certain perspective will be coming out. In earlier sociological works, have tried to explain that post-independence government was pro-labor and it had passed the law to protect the working class. However, many argue that it may be correct to some extent if it is compared with the labor policy during colonial regime, in which the government was hostile to labor and trade union. So we talk about E.A. Ramaswamy project that in a state's prolonged interest in protecting labor was actually harming the movement, and since instead of challenging the employees trade unions had become more interested in getting state support for their demands. S.K. Bhaumik has concluded a similar kind of perspective, that how the multi-trade unionism is basically proving to be a threat or certain kind of roadblock to the benefits of the workers. And there you can also pick up the certain. N.R. Seth takes a critical look at the trade union movement. He notes that while conventional trade unions are supposed to organize workers against employees, the employees have begun to see or use methods of participative management as a means to combine with workers against union. So you pick up that one. Child labor could be at another area from where, but I am finding, I just was looking at this only 1 year, the question on the child labor has been talked about. So talk about the constitutional provisions, the Child Labor Act, all right, and do pick up some new kind of perspective. Do raise some of the very critical concerns in the child labor. A very general overall blanket of the child labor is now raising the certain questions in terms of that whom would you prefer, the child who is working early in the morning then coming to the school, and the one who at all is not coming to the school, because the moment if you say that I'll prefer the first one, the child who is working at early in the morning then coming to the school, then you would basically be trapped that he would be a child labor. So that way you raise this concern, so some sort of change according to the societal conditions of the country needs to be brought in the child labor. That way the things would be there. But overall, when we are looking at the very formation of a child labor, let me very briefly say you that in most of the developed countries, precisely the industrial countries, when the industrialization began, apart from the man and woman, the children also got the opportunity to work in the industries. In terms of the low wages, in terms of the more working hours. So it provided, industrialization provided the equal opportunity to all, the adults to the children. But very soon the idea surfaced that if we are talking about a certain civilized society, that children should be there with the schools, not with the factories. And in this very perspective, the attempts were initiated to form a Child Labour Act. That how the banning of the children working in the hazardous industry that has started emerging out, that anticipation has started emerging out. But it was also ensured in these industrial societies that if this such kind of acts are being enacted simultaneously, there must be certain kind of enactment of the compulsory education that the children who would be taken out of the factories would not be left in the street, rather they should be associated with the schools. So you just pick up, and it was said that when we are marching toward the modernity, working of the childs in the factories is not a good indicator of the modernity, and so that way the Child Labour Acts started emerging out. But in the same perspective, the sociologists have also raised that the moment you enact or pass a child labour, you also deny the beneficial aspect of the child. That once you say ban, completely ban the children not working in the factories, it is not simply a ban. It is also a denial of the valuable aspect of the child's labour. So this way, in terms of the sociological dimension that we will be talking about, let me give you one sociological interpretation so that the things should be much more easier. In most of the countries, the work undertaken by the children had for a long time been explained as socialization, education, training. At the same time, in many societies, age is used with the gender as a justification for the value accorded to the work. However, the low valuation of children's work translates into the children's vulnerability in the labor market. But more importantly, their exclusion from remunerated employment, and thus the current child labor policies fail to address the exclusion of children from the production of value paradoxically, which paradoxically is reinforcing the children's vulnerability to exploitation and their value to the labor, their labor value that is being ignored. Irrespective of what children do and what they think of what they do, modern society sets children apart from ideologically as a category of people excluded from the production of a value. Since the dissociation of children from the performance of value to work is considered a yardstick of modernity. I repeat, इस लाइन को गौर करना बेटा. Irrespective of what children do and what they think they do, modern society sets children apart ideologically as a category of people excluded from the production of value. Since the disassociation of children from the performance of value to work is considered a yardstick of modernity, and the high incidence of child labor is considered a sign of underdevelopment. However, this perspective of defining children's role certainly denies their agencies in a creation and negotiation of value. Thus, in some of the sociological works, the idea surfaced that now the time has come to critically introspect or examine the relationship between condemnation of child labor at one hand and children's everyday work practice on the other hand. The denial of their capacity to legitimately act upon their environment by undertaking valuable works make children altogether dependent on the entitlements generated by the state. So we just pick up the most of the child labor analysis. The focus also shifted to the fact that how from the mid of 19th century onwards, Western industrial society began to eliminate through legislation the exploitation of children. In this context, Nardinelli, Nardeinelli, Nardinelli argues that beside humanitarian reasons, there was a desire to protect the initiatives to mechanize the textile industries from the uncontrolled competition of the labor force, composed almost entirely of the children. All right, now things are becoming very clear to you. Minge, Coleman and others argue that the fear of political instability created by the youthful working class not to be disciplined by army, church or school was the reason for this enactment of acts. Winner argued that compulsory education was the most important instrument leading to the formation of child labor, and thus in the West, starting from the industrial countries, then during the colonization and later on in the other parts of the globe, the state legislations marked the major initiatives toward the formulation of the Child Labor Act. The legislations started emerging out, banning the child to work, and under a certain age the children cannot work, and then under the age of 14 they cannot work in the others' work. So you just pick up, these are the certain sociological dimensions. Most of the countries in the world have adopted or rectified the modified version of child labor legislations proposed and propagated by ILO. So you just pick up from there. But do not forget that how in the Factories Act and others, when you have the blanket ban on the children, all right, you do not equally ensure that at one hand you are banning the children not to work. Fine. All right. And if you are attributing that to the sign of modernity, that if the large number of workforce or the factories where the children are working, it is not a sign of modernity. Fine, agree. But are we equally ensuring that the children who have been banned not to work are brought to the school system? Are we ensuring that when we have taken them from the factories, banned them from not to work from the factories, they are not left on the street? And what about the poor? Because this poverty breeds poverty, and where we are talking about that how poor have been accused of a larger families, because with the larger families they basically want to substantiate the meager income of the family. The child born has the 2 hands to work but only 1 mouth to eat. If such kind of perspective is coming out in a poor family, there is the economic value of the children. Now when we are talking about that they should not work in the factories and legislations are there, are the first perspective that are we providing them that they would not be left in the street? Alright, they would be basically associated with this educational system. This is the first perspective you raise it. And what about those child who somehow or other early in the morning they work, provide a support to the meager income of the family, then they come to the school, versus those children who are at all not coming to the school? Raise this debate as well. And when we talk about that, how when we have passed the Factory Acts, then how the children are now used in a clandestine one, in the homes, working as a maids or in the dhabas. Are these laws being implemented properly? Are the children being provided with better facilities and better career growth? You just pick up these all dimensions in terms of the child labor. Nardinelli, I talked about, you just pick up that one work will be remember, that will be more important one, challenging that why, what was the purpose of the child labor. The different sociological works reveal that the poor children who are not employed perform crucial work, often in the domestic arena, in subsistence agriculture, and in the urban informal sector. There is a persistent belief that schooling is the perfect antidote to the child labor. But for this, the state will have to ensure that no children are left outside the school. They are not left in the streets, along with sustaining the economic viability of the poor family, which he belongs to, and also to recognize the valuational aspect of the child. Getting me now? So for this we have talked about that education is a fundamental right. But I always say that when you say education is a fundamental right, and we talked about Article 21A, 51AK, that at least one line which I wanted you to mind, that education as a fundamental right is enjoyed only by those children who have managed to come to the school. Those children who have not managed to come to the school, education as a fundamental right is not working. Because there is no compulsion on the state to ensure that none or no child would be left to the street, rather every child would be related to the educational system. And there is also no compulsion on the parents to send their children to the school. So some incentives are to be brought in. And in this very perspective, simply you are denying that then they are working in informal sectors, they are working in a dabas, they are working in the domestic arena, in a subsistence agriculture. You cannot simply deny the educational aspect of the child. In the last few years, certain NGOs concerns with children have been encouraged to develop low-cost solutions to address the problem of child labor, which is based on combination of work and school. Both are going on by recognizing the need of poor children to contribute to their own upkeep and also to help their families, and then coming to the school. So this approach has gained support with the certain sectors of ILO as well. So you pick up this dimension, and that way you work on the formal organization, informalization of activities, women and work, child labor, trade union. These are the certain areas through which we will be talking about the industrial sociology. But once again I am saying, and I'm time and again I have said, that when you are preparing, when you are sitting down with the sociology for your mains to prepare, when you pick up the certain units to go through, you just try to find out that what are the other units which are very similar in the second paper, bring it there. So when you are going for the work and economic life, bring this one. Because there are so many data you are talking about in terms of the Weber, formal organizations, you talk about the human relations, or you talk about the Taylorism, such kind of quotients which are coming out. Generally, you will also be finding about the similar quotients of formal and informal in terms of the second paper as well. The trade unions and others which are coming out. So you just add something. But overall the conceptual dimension would be there. And from tomorrow when I will be talking about the political process, make it a point that I will be not talking about the political process as the 2 days has been there, which I was looking at. We will be talking it at one go. We will be developing the concepts in terms of the first paper, the political sociology, the theories of power, civil society, the pressure groups. We will also be using the same data in terms of the Indian society, because the similar kind of perspectives are there. When we are talking about the elite rules in a political dimensions there, then we will also be talking about the social background of elites in India. So in a similar perspective we are talking about, so that we can compare, we can provide the use of the conceptual format from the first to the second one. So that way tomorrow when I am talking about the politics and society, ensuring that this politics and society what we are talking about and the certain concept we will be picking up will also be there for the Indian society as well. We will not be bifurcating that one. When I am talking about the religion, we will also be talking about raising certain concerns of religion from the Indian context as well. And so that way the things will be coming to you. Alright? And then tomorrow we will be looking at some other unit. Thank you.